everybody here, and good morning and welcome to our international audience. I'm going to be sharing something with you. We're going to get into John today, John chapter 8, starting in verse 52, which is where we left off last week. But before I do, I want to talk for just a few minutes, just only a few minutes, about something I've been talking about for quite a number of years, and that's the 40th Jubilee. And I've said this many times, but there's something I've written here on the board that I have not explained. I haven't written it before on the board. But I have talked about this quite a bit here in church over the years. There are two possibilities about the 40th Jubilee, which I want to explain. First of all, the Jubilee year, mentioned in Leviticus 25, talks about it's the year of liberty. It's the year of the cancellation of all debts and everything. And the Jews believe that when the Messiah comes, he will set up his kingdom in a Jubilee year. Now, that may be true. The Jubilee, if you read it, because all the laws of God were shadows or foreshadows of things to come. Passover was a foreshadow of the Messiah dying. He died on that very day, at the very hour when they killed the Passover lamb. Pentecost was when they gave the law in Exodus 20. If you study it out, it was the third day of the third month on God's biblical calendar, and that just happened to be a Sunday, and that was 7 weeks after Passover. And so these were shadows of things to come. Well, the Jubilee is a shadow of the coming of the Messiah. Now, what I have mentioned is there's a 7-year period, the 70th week of Daniel. Don't listen to the Seventh-day Adventists and others who say that Jesus fulfilled the first half of that. No, he didn't. You go back and read Daniel 9:27, and it says, he, talking about the Antichrist, will cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. That's after the temple has been reestablished in the last days. Seventh-day Adventists and other cults teach that Jesus abolished all those ceremonial laws and rituals and sacrifices, and that he fulfilled the first half. Listen, believe what Jesus said. He said, don't think I've come to destroy even a jot or tittle of the law. Now remember, hermeneutically, to a Jew, the law did not mean the Ten Commandments only. The law meant Genesis chapter 1 to Deuteronomy 34. That was the law. That included all the ceremonies, all the sacrifices, the holy days, everything, tithing. I mean, the whole package of law. He said, don't think I've come to destroy one bit. I'm the only minister I know that believes that. Every church I have been in, visited, or associated with teaches that Jesus abolished at least the ceremonial laws. And once you say, okay, well, all right, if he abolished the ceremonial laws, what constitute the ceremonial laws? And they'll say, well, the Ten Commandments are still in force, but now some of the statutes, some of the judgments. But everybody disagrees as to what's a ceremonial law. The Seventh-day Adventists say the Ten Commandments should be kept, including the seventh-day Sabbath, but the holy days are ceremonial laws. So once you open up that can of worms and say that some of the laws are ceremonial, then we pick and choose as to which law we don't like. Oh, that's ceremonial, and Jesus did away with ceremonial laws. Listen, even the laws you don't like, Jesus didn't do away with any of them. And then people quote Romans 6:14, we are not under the law, but under grace. See, we don't have to keep the law. No, read verse 15. He said, what then? Shall we sin? Shall we transgress the law because we're not under it? He said, God forbid. No, we still are to keep the law, though we are not under any of the laws for salvation. We're justified by grace through faith. All right, so I'm going to show you something here. I don't know if the camera, can you?
I set the cameras up for that to be in the shot, in both shots.
Okay, good. The 70th week of Daniel, Jesus did not fulfill the first half of that. Did not. The Antichrist will fulfill the first half of that. So the 7-year period, being the last week of 7 years, has not been fulfilled. But once they offer the red heifer, and they offer what Daniel 9 calls and also chapter 12 calls the daily sacrifice. When the daily sacrifice is taken away, that's when the abomination of desolation is set up. Jesus said, when you see that spoken of by Daniel the prophet, that's when the great tribulation begins. Matthew 24, verse 15 and verse 21. All right, so I have often said the year 2031 will be the 2000th year of the cross. It is. Now we have a lesson 4, that absolutely proves that Jesus is the Messiah based on Daniel chapter 9 and the correct understanding of the 70 weeks prophecy. The terminus I quoted, the beginning point, was when the command to build the city, not the temple, but the city came. That was done by Artaxerxes Longimanus in 446 BC. If you understand, you're to count 69 prophetic weeks of years. That leads you to the year 31. All right, this is now 2,000 years later. In the year 2031, which is about 7 years from now, that will be the 2000th anniversary of when Jesus was crucified. We've only got a few short years yet. My whole life I've heard people say, well, it's been nearly 2,000 years, or it's almost 2,000 years. And just a few years from now, we're going to say it's been over 2,000 years. Now, if Christ should come back, now by the way, the scholars tell us that they believe when they do their study and they do their genealogical study and chronological study, they believe there was a Jubilee period during the ministry of Jesus. He was ordained when he was 30, and his baptism actually signified his ordination, the beginning of his ministry. And so that would have been in the year 27. He was born in 4 BC, do the math. So his ministry was 3.5 years. It went from 27 AD to 31, all right? Some people think maybe the first year of his ministry was the Jubilee. But when did he liberate man? When he died on the cross. And I have said for many years, I think 31 was probably the actual Jubilee year. From the year 31 until 1981 has been 39 Jubilees. The one that's coming up will be number 40. Now, what's significant about that? 40 is the number of trial and testing. It means the completion of trial and testing. The spies were tried and tested and fearful when they were in the land of Canaan for 40 days. Israel had to stay out in the land for 40 years. Moses fasted for 40 days. Jesus fasted for 40 days. The flood was 40 days. So 40 is a significant number. By the way, Saul ruled Israel for 40 years. David ruled for 40 years. And Solomon ruled for 40 years. So 40 is a significant number in the Bible. This is the 40th Jubilee that's coming up. All right, now that I've given you that introduction, let me tell you what I've got here. Two possible scenarios. If Jesus were to come back at the 40th Jubilee, the 7-year period would start, and they may have, in 2024. That was last year. Now, you might say, well, they're not offering sacrifices. When the war started, if you read the reports as I did, the Muslims publicly stated that the reason we attacked Israel on October 7th was because we heard that in October they were going to, this was in 2023, they started the war in October 2023. We heard that the Jews were going to sacrifice the red heifer. And if they do that, they're going to start the daily sacrifice on the Temple Mount. And of course, they have that golden dome of the rock on the Temple Mount. And so this whole war has been fighting over a cow. Believe it or not, the whole war is based on the fact that they have the red heifer there. The war's still going on. So there were a lot of updates up until October of 2023. There were a lot of updates about those 5 red heifers they had. 2 or 3 are disqualified now, but they still have 1 or 2, maybe even up to 3 that are still qualified to be offered. Now, last year they said, see, October of 2023, we don't know what happened. But they did say no later than Passover of last year, they'd offer up the red heifer. But you know what? Because of the war, there's been a news blackout. We don't know what's going on. Now, I told you there were 2 possibilities if they offer up the red heifer. One, they could put the ashes of the red heifer in an urn, set it aside, and wait until the proper time, or they could have started right away offering up the daily sacrifice. About 2 years ago, Benjamin Netanyahu segregated a certain part of the Temple Mount to be used for Jewish usage only. The Arabs know what that's for. They're going to be setting up the altar there. How do we know they haven't already been offering up a daily sacrifice? How do we know it didn't already start in 2024? If it did, not just a single sacrifice, but a daily sacrifice. If it did start, say, in October of this past year, and it may have, or even last April at Passover, 7 years later would bring you to 2030. The tribulation starts in the midway point after the first half of the 3.5 years. And then after that period of time, you have two things that have to happen after the 7-year period is over. When it's over and done with, Jesus said in Matthew 24:29, after the tribulation, not during, after you have the heavenly signs. The sun goes dark, moon shall not give light, stars fall from heaven. All right? So after the heavenly signs, what do you have next? Some of you graduates, you know? What comes after the heavenly signs?
One of the seals.
Well,
Is it the 5th seal? The 6th seal?
the 6th seal is
Is the heavenly sign.
the heavenly
Okay,
signs.
so it's the trumpet.
So the 7th seal comes after number 6.
Here comes Jesus.
Yeah, the 7th seal introduces the great and terrible day of the Lord. And the Bible does not tell us how long that is. But Isaiah 61 and other prophecies indicate that the day of the Lord may be a full year or close to it. So the 7-year period would be over here. The day of the Lord would be here. Christ would return toward the end of that year, possibly the autumn. That's the first scenario. Now, I've been telling all of you this over a period of time over the last several years. There's a second scenario, but I don't know if I've shared it with our audience online or not. There's a second scenario. Maybe all of these things will start at the 40th Jubilee. And if the Jubilee is the year 2031, that could be the beginning of the 7-year period up to 2038. And then 1 year later, Jesus could come back around 2039 or 2040. Now, by the way, I do not set dates. I am not setting dates. I never have set dates. Jesus said no man knows the day or the hour, but he also never said you won't know the year. And I'll be the first to say I do not know the year. I'm just telling you that it's interesting. We have a Jubilee coming up in our generation. It only happens every 50 years. This next Jubilee is either going to probably be the culmination of these prophecies, or it could be the beginning of these end time prophecies. Either way, the bottom line is this: you and I need to make sure that we are really dedicated studying the Word of God. We're in church every single time the doors are open here on the Sabbath. We need to be in church. We need to be studying. For those of you online, if you haven't yet signed up for online classes, take our online classes. You can start now, isn't that right? Our registrar sits right here.
Yeah, they need to let me know though. I mean, I need to get an email.
Get an email off to, it's Janetta at ambassadorchristiancollege.us, right?
Yes.
And she's got 2 M's in her name. So send her an email and tell her you need, she'll send you an application. Listen, there is nothing more important, I don't think, right now than studying the Bible, not just studying prophecy. Passover is about 7 weeks away. Right now we're in the Gospel of John, and that's an ideal book to be in when you're getting ready to prepare for Passover. The churches of this world, you know what they're getting ready to do? They're getting ready to celebrate Easter. They're going to buy all their new outfits and new clothes for Easter. They're going to buy their Easter eggs and teach their kids how to dye Easter eggs and all this stuff. And I'm not going to take time to go into the origin of Easter, but you can go on the internet and learn more about it, and I know. Don't just write in Easter in your subject headline or your browser. Write the word pagan Easter, and you'll get more information than I know. It's there. It's available. Are there any questions on these 2 possible scenarios, this one and this one? Yes, ma'am.
Can you just go over the full timeline again, starting from, I guess, the heavenly signs, or before that?
Well, you have when the daily sacrifice starts, that starts the 7-year period. Daniel 9 says, in the midst of that 7-year period, that week, the abomination that maketh the desolate is set up. And Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation set up, then flee, run, get out of there if you're in Jerusalem, for then shall be great tribulation. So it starts in the middle of this 7-year period right here. All right, so that could be right here. It could be around the year 2027 maybe.
But what are the seals?
Well, the seven seals are on the book of Revelation. The first four seals are the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and that's all kinds of horrible things. The first one is deception by the Antichrist. The next three are warfare, famine, hunger, death. And then seal number 5 deals with all the Christians who are going to die during the tribulation. So that's the tribulation. The first four are the horsemen of the apocalypse, and that is the horrible, horrible tribulation. But seal number 5 deals with all the many, many Christians. If only 1 or 2 Christians died, it wouldn't get mentioned in the Bible. But there are going to be so many Christians that are going to die during the tribulation, it gets honorable mention. A whole seal is dedicated to it. And yet the whole church world says if you get saved, you won't be here during the tribulation. They're deceiving hundreds of millions of people. This Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and David Jeremiah. Remember I played for you a record here, recording of what David Jeremiah said last April. And last April, I recorded that for you. Hey, come in. And he said, this year's the year of the rapture. And I stood right here and I said, it won't happen. It won't happen.
So where's the 6th seal?
All right, the 6th seal would be the heavenly signs. Now, since Jesus said that comes after the tribulation, the first 5 seals are the tribulation. Seal number 6, the heavenly signs, occurs before the great and terrible day of the Lord. That's Joel chapter 2, verse 31. So you have, here are your 7 seals. You have 5 that are the tribulation. You have number 6, that's the heavenly signs. Number 7 is the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, in the day of the Lord, you have 7 trumpets, but Jesus does not come back at the first trumpet. You have to go all the way through till you get to the end of the day of the Lord, which could be this year. And at the end of the day of the Lord, that's when Jesus returns, and that's when we go up. Any other questions? So I want to share that with you because those are the 2 scenarios that may involve the Jubilee year. So what does that mean? The bottom line is, brother, we better get into the Bible and study as never before. Make that our number 1 priority, not the World Series or not the, what was this thing that happened last weekend?
The Super Bowl.
Super Bowl, yeah. I'm not saying it's wrong to watch ball games, but don't get just totally absorbed with what's going on in the world. Get into God's Word. Become a true Philadelphian Christian. Because if all this stuff happens this soon, now it may not. Maybe it won't happen. The next possibility, this is the 40th Jubilee. The next most likely Jubilee would not be the 41st. Probably be the 50th Jubilee. So that's only 500 more years away. How many of y'all are going to be around here in 500 more years? You will be. Well, I would expect you to be. But the rest of us won't be here 500 years from now. We'll die of old age. So here's the thing. If Jesus comes back in our lifetime, either this or the year, say, 2039 or 2040, those would be the most likely times if he were to come back. But again, I'm not setting dates. But let me say one thing. When people criticize me and say, Jesus said nobody knows when he's coming back, wrong. He didn't say that. Nope. You can't show it to me in the Bible. You don't know the day, Tuesday or Wednesday, and you don't know whether it's in the morning or the afternoon. You don't know whether he said it's in that day, and then he says, and in that night. So one place in the world is going to be daytime, one place is going to be night. We don't know the day and the hour, but technically he never said you won't know the year. Therefore, since he didn't say we won't, we could know the year. And after the 6th trumpet or the 6th seal takes place, we may very, very absolutely know the exact year. But even then, we won't know if it's going to be a Tuesday or a Wednesday. We don't know the day and we don't know the hour. Now, it may be morning here. It might be 10 o'clock in the morning here, but it'll only be 9 o'clock in Texas. So you won't know the hour.
There's a question.
All right, what's the question?
Will martyrdom affect those living in the U.S. or anyone around the world?
Revelation 3, verses 8 through 10. What?
I said, yeah, everyone.
Yeah, the Greek word for world there, it talks about it's going to come on the earth, and it says that it mentions the word world there. And the Greek word oikoumene, and that's the best pronunciation I can come up with, means the inhabited earth. The only exception would be in Antarctica, where the only people who inhabit it would be penguins. But now, yeah, it's going to occur on the inhabited earth. So right here where we live in America, yeah, tribulation is going to hit us. Because I looked at that years ago and thought, well, maybe it's only going to be in Palestine. We'll get out of it. We're looking at World War III. Good question. All right, are there any other questions before we get into the book of John?
Let me check you too. No.
Okay.
Not so far.
So since we're only about 2 months away or less, Passover will be the middle of April. Last year it was the last week of April. Every year it's going to migrate backwards 11 days. So this year it's going to be the middle of April. And next year, it's going to be, again, 11 days short. Okay, let's go to John chapter 8, and we're going to start the last verse we read last week. I'll start in the last two verses, verse 50. Jesus said, I seek not my own glory. There is one that seeks and judges. Jesus sought the glory of God. And then he said, verily, verily, which means truly, truly, I say to you, if a man keep my saying, he'll never see death. Now, before I get into, I stopped at that last week, but I want to look at this one more time. Once you come up in the resurrection, from that point forward, you'll never see death. But you and I, if we live, like somebody has said, if you live long enough, one day you're going to die. If you live long enough. We're all going to die of old age. If not in a plane crash, car crash, old age will hit you. But once you come up in the resurrection, from that point forward, you're not, as far as I can see from the Bible, you'll never even have a headache or a toothache. You'll have a glorified body if you come up in the first resurrection, and you'll never see death. Now that's for people who believe on Jesus. For people who come up in the second resurrection, there's no promise that you won't see death. There is a second death, which I won't get into right now. Truly, truly, I say to you, if a man keep my saying, he'll never see death. In verse 52, where we're officially starting today, then the Jews said, now we know that we know you got a devil now, because Abraham's dead. And the prophets, and you say, if a man keep my saying, he'll never taste of death. They didn't understand. He's talking about from the resurrection forward. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead? Now, Jesus could have contradicted them and said, well, he's not actually dead. He went on to be with the Lord. I've heard, I'll listen to Joel Osteen. And he's a motivational speaker. And as a motivational speaker, he's good. He's not a gospel preacher. He's not technically an evangelist. But I've heard him say over and over and over, when my father went on to be with the Lord. His father never died. He never says when my father died, or I've never heard him say it. He says, when my father went on to be with the Lord. Why didn't Jesus say Abraham went on to be with the Lord? He didn't say that. They said Abraham is dead, and he did not contradict them. Abraham is dead. They said, well, who do you make yourself to be? Jesus answered, if I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It's my Father that honors me, of whom you say that he is your God. Yet you have not known him. See, they said, who do you make yourself to be? Jesus ignored the part about Abraham. He just went on and answered their question. You have not known him, he said, but I know him. Jesus knew God. And if I should say I don't know him, I'd be a liar like you. Man, he just laid on the line, didn't he? That's not very tactful. I'd be a liar like you, but I know him and keep his saying. Your father Abraham, and Abraham is the father of all the tribes of Israel. Your father Abraham, excuse me, rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Excuse me. I want to point out something to you. Verse 57, the Jews said, you are not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? That's not what Jesus said. Now let's use exegesis. Exegesis means you say, what does the text actually say? He said, Abraham saw me. Thank you. I mean, look, what if I said, I went to Washington, D.C. last week, and the president got to see me? Now, what would you think of that? You know, you'd say, you got to see the president? Wow, you saw him in person? You got into the White House? But what would you think if I said he got to see me? And I'm bragging. Jesus said, Abraham rejoiced to see me. What he's saying is, I'm greater than Abraham. That's what he's saying. I'm greater than Abraham. Any questions so far? But from their perspective, Abraham was the greatest. And so they didn't understand why he was saying this the way he did. And then he made an amazing statement. Very truly, before Abraham was, I am. Why didn't he say I was? Because he was. Jesus existed before Abraham was born. He was the God of the Old Testament. But it's interesting how he said it. Before Abraham was, I am. Because that's the Greek expression for Yah, which is part of the Tetragrammaton, which means he that was, he that is, and he that shall be. But also when Moses said, what is your name? God gave them the abbreviated form, I am. I am that I am. So go tell Pharaoh that I am has sent you. And Jesus says before Abraham was, I am. It's an interesting expression. Any questions? Then they took up stones to stone him because that was considered blasphemy. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Why didn't he allow them just to go ahead and stone him? Did he not come here to die for the sins of mankind? Or why didn't he allow them to go ahead and kill him right then? Yeah, it wasn't his time. Over and over, he said, my hour has not yet come. Jesus had to die in a specific year based on the 70 weeks prophecy. He had to die in a specific month and a specific week. And I can prove to you from the 70 weeks prophecy the exact year, the exact month, and the exact week. But I can't show you for sure the exact day, but I can show you the exact week. And Jesus died that very week. All right, let's go to chapter 9. As he passed by, he saw a man who was blind from his birth. The disciples ask a very relevant question to us today. Who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? To this day, people ask that question. When a child is born with deformities, did their parents sin? Sometimes they do. If a child is born with, say, herpes simplex 2, sometimes they get it going through the birth canal if the mother has it. And maybe she's been out sinning, and the baby may pay the penalty for her sin. That can happen. But some children are just born, and of course, it's not the child who sinned. But they asked that question. It was a theological question they even had in that day, so they thought they'd ask the Messiah. Now, in this particular case, Jesus said, neither has this man sinned, meaning that brought his blindness on, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. It was God's intent to heal this man, and it would give glory to God. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when nobody can work. Now, today we have third shift workers. We have electricity. You can work in a building 24 hours a day. You got lights, electric lights. But in that day and time, when the sun set, you went inside and you spent the evening with your family. The night comes when no man can work, and he's speaking spiritually, of course. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Now later he said the church is the light, because we're the body of Christ. And when he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. Now people think that's unsanitary. Sometimes, remember what Paul said, condescend to men of low estate. Get down on their level. In that day and time, they thought that spittle had medicinal qualities. See, we're just getting the outline here. Jesus may have had a 10, 15-minute conversation with this man before he did this. And that man apparently thought that spittle had medicinal qualities. Okay, let's get down on your level, all right? Let's make some spit here. Put it in the clay. Slap it on his eyes. And the man believed. Because he didn't do that with anybody else that we know, but he did to this fellow. And he said, now go wash in the pool of Siloam, which by translation means sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed, and he came seeing. God healed him. What if the man said, nah, I'm blind, that won't do any good. I'll just stay right here and beg. He would not have been healed. If you want to be healed, start obeying God. 1 John 3:22 says, whatever we ask, we receive because And here's the condition, because we keep his commandments. This man kept Jesus' commandment and he was healed. The neighbors therefore, now this is an interesting chapter. It talks about fear religion. And if you've ever been in a cult, you can identify with this. The Jewish religion had become somewhat of a cult in Jesus' day. Now, yeah, they had the truth about the law and so on, but they had become a cult in their thinking. The neighbors, therefore, when they'd seen him, that he that was blind, they said, is not this he that sat and begged? Some said, yeah, this is the same guy. Others said, well, he's like him. But he said, no, I am he. Therefore, they said to him, how were your eyes open? He said, well, there was this man called Jesus. He made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed and I received sight. He's just reporting what happened. And then they said to him, well, where is he? He said, I don't know. And they brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. Now it just happened to be the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then again, the Pharisees also asked him, how did he receive his sight? He said, he put clay on my eyes and I washed and I do see. Now, I actually met a man who had a doctorate in theology. He didn't come out of our school, believe me. But this man had a doctorate in theology from a college out in California. And he said Jesus transgressed God's law. He broke the Sabbath. Because right in the book of John, it says he broke the Sabbath. He took it out of context. Therefore said, and I underline the word said here, therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God because he keeps not the Sabbath day. Now, is John telling you that Jesus broke the fourth commandment? No, he's telling you what they said. John's a good reporter. Some said he did. But this minister, this was an ordained minister, who said that Jesus actually broke the Sabbath. Well, he transgressed the law. What is the definition of sin? It's when you transgress the law. So he was accusing Jesus of being a sinner because it says right here in the Bible he didn't keep the Sabbath. Read it again. Look at the third line. Because he keeps not the Sabbath day. There it is right there in the Bible. But read the whole verse. This is what some of them said. And not even all of them. Therefore said some of the Pharisees. Now, if you're going to believe that he didn't keep the Sabbath, look at line number 2. They also said this man is not of God. Now, how could that preacher claim to be a Christian and believe that this was inspired by God to teach you that Jesus is not of God? It says right there, this man is not of God. So people will take things out of context and twist them to make it say what they want it to say. Others said, you see what John is doing? He didn't say, thus saith the Lord. This is what people are saying. How can a man who is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. That's all he's doing. They said to the blind man, again, what do you say of him that he's opened your eyes? He said, he's a prophet. Now that's what he assumed. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight till they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, is this your son whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see? Now they didn't want to get in trouble with the Pharisees. Fear of religion. They were afraid. And they asked him, how does he see? Verse 20, his parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son. We know he was born blind, but by what means he now sees, we don't know, or who has opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age. Ask him, he'll speak for himself. If they had said, that man, Jesus of Nazareth, must really be the Messiah, they'd have thrown them out of the synagogue. And being put out of the church, that was the church in that day, was a horrible, horrible thing. But by what means he sees, we don't know. Ask him for yourself. Verse 22, these words spoke his parents because they feared the Jews. Fear religion. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. It's interesting, the word synagogue is not a Hebrew word. It's a word that means gathering place. What is our church organization? What is our church building? It's a gathering place. I know of churches that if you don't agree 100% with the pastor, they put you out. Now, you can agree or disagree with me, and I'm not going to put you out. Come on, you might learn something. Or I might learn something from you, but I'm not going to put you out because you don't agree 100%. But I've been in churches like that. Yes, sir.
If you don't mind me adding to it, historically, that was also the financial center too. So it would be almost that, you know, if you're kicked out of the temple, which is one of the arguments Jesus had against him, was you're also not gonna have any financial backing, credibility, and nobody can do business with you. So it was greater than just the place of worship back then too.
So it affected your finances. You may end up in bankruptcy.
How did it affect finances?
It was also the center of influence financially in that area. You know, if you're kicked out of the church, out of the synagogue, people won't want to do business with you when it comes to trade, getting grains, meats. You can't bring a sacrifice. So there's a lot of financial hurt that can happen too if you were to speak against those Pharisees, Sadducees, and the heads of the temple.
So it was like getting a bad reputation.
Yeah.
And so because of that, they wouldn't do business with you.
Yep. Because nobody else wants to go under that kind of pressure, so they would give into it, and it would be very challenging for you to be picking up your family and moving somewhere else.
In other words, to use the vernacular of this day, you're being canceled.
You're being canceled. Imagine that you can't go into a bank to get money. Nobody will take your money, so therefore, could you even buy groceries in today's world?
Yeah.
And that's what it would be like.
I was in a church that if they found out you were just visiting other churches, they would disfellowship you. And your closest friends in that church could not talk to you. If they saw you coming down the street on the sidewalk, they'd cross the street to go on the other side because they weren't allowed to talk to you. Your closest friends were not allowed to talk to you.
That's a cult.
That is a cult with a capital C. That's a cult. And that's how the Jewish religion had already become at this time. Verse 23, therefore his parents said he's of age, ask him, because they were in fear. Then again, they called the man that was blind and said, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. That's what they said about Christ. He answered and said, well, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, I was blind, now I can see. I like this old boy. Then they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered and said, I've told you already, and you didn't hear. Wherefore, why would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. We're Moses' disciples, but they didn't believe in Jesus. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't know from whence he is. Modern English, we don't know where he came from. The man answered and said to them, why, herein is a marvelous thing, that you don't know from where he came from, from whence he is, where he came from. And yet he's opened my eyes. Now, verse 31, we need to look at this. Now we know that God hears not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and does his will, him he hears. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. Boy, that made them mad. Now, before I go on, I want to go back to verse 31. I'm not about to ask you to raise your hand, but in the last 12 months, rhetorically, I could ask you the question, has anybody here ever done anything wrong for which you had to ask God to forgive you for? Have you ever committed a sin? If you have, in the last year or 2 years or 5 years or whatever, is God not hearing your prayer? Interesting. This man is actually, what he is saying is based on Scripture. In Psalm 66, verse 18, it says, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. There are quite a number of other scriptures that say that if you got sin in your life, God won't hear your prayers. That's pretty serious. But I want you to notice carefully, again, we're going to look at this exegetically. What else does it say? And John didn't correct this man. But if any man be a worshiper of God, but if you worship God, what type of sinner is it that God absolutely does not hear? The person who doesn't even worship God. Now, I'm talking to Christians today. You may slip. You may fall down once in a while. You may stumble. But you are a worshiper of God, aren't you? And now here's the part that always got me. If any man be a worshiper and does his will, and I'd stop and say, no, wait a minute, am I doing God's will? Well, not perfectly. Sometimes I don't even know what his will is. So how do I know if I'm doing his will? You know, a lot of it has to do with intent, because in Revelation 12:17, it says, in the last days there will be Christians who keep the commandments of God. You know, and I know, that those people that God is talking about are not perfect. Well, then what is a commandment keeper in God's sight? It's somebody like you who tries and puts forth the effort to keep the commandments. And even though you may slip and fall, you're still a commandment keeper. I think it's chapter 24, I believe it is, in Proverbs. It says a just man, just means righteous, falls 7 times. And yet God says he's just. How can he be just if he falls and falls and falls and falls and falls and falls and falls? How can God call him just? Because to fall that many times, that means you had to get up. He fell, but he got back up, and he fell and he got back up, and he kept getting up and he kept getting up. God says, that's a righteous man. The devil says, look how many times he fell, and God says, look how many times he got up. You can see the glass of water half full, or you can see it half empty. So if you're trying to keep the commandments, you're a commandment keeper. Does that make sense? Now, what is James 2:10 when it says, if you offend in one point, you're guilty of all? I don't offend. I might slip and fall like you. I might lose my temper. But to offend is, you know, when my parents told me to do something, this is an offense. I will not. Now, boy, if I'd have said that to my daddy or even my mother, I would have found out that was an offense. My mother used to say, go get me a limb off the tree there. Go get me a hickory stick, she called it.
That would have been a whooping.
Yeah, that wasn't a whipping, that was a whooping. And my daddy had a hand, the biggest hand I've ever seen in my life. It was like this long. I mean, my hand was only this big when I was a little kid, but boy, he had a huge hand. He didn't use a paddle, he just used his hand. Although he would use his belt once in a while. I was such a sweet little boy. I did not deserve that. I was a good little kid. You know, he'd take his belt off. If I did anything that seemed to offend him, I got it. But when he saw me trying, even though I did wrong, he would say, but let me help you do that better. One time, the worst whooping I ever got was when my daddy said, go get the broom and clean off the front porch. And I said, I don't think it needs it. That's all I said. But I went back into the house and I got the broom out of the closet and I was getting ready. But boy, that offended him terribly when I said, I don't think it needs it. That's all I had to say. And I couldn't sit down for the next couple of hours. I remember that very, very well. In fact, it was so bad, my mother got on to him and he apologized to me that night. I remember that very, very well. I was only about 7 or 8 years old. I remember it very, very well. But if you're trying to keep God's commandments, that's not an offense. But when James says, if you offend, like, I will not keep the 4th commandment, you can't make me, I ain't going to do it. God says, okay, that's an offense. If you see, you may slip and accidentally break the Sabbath, but that's not offending God because you're trying. People ask questions. Is it okay to wash maybe, you don't want to wash dishes, but could you wash just a saucer? How about just 1 coffee cup? A lot of ministers will say, oh, no, yeah, I think you could do that. Well, if you can wash 1, could you wash 2? You know, where do you draw the line? There's some areas that are gray areas. So let's say you just overstep it just a little bit. You're not offending. You're trying to obey God, but, you know, there are some gray areas. So what is a worshiper of God? That's what you guys are. You're in church today because you worship God. And you're not offending God, even though you may on occasion sin. So the kind of sinner that God does not hear is the kind of sinner that won't even worship God. You understand? So don't go home tonight and say, God doesn't hear my prayers. Why? Because last week I said a word I shouldn't have said. No, if you're trying to serve God, he'll hear your prayers. Any questions on that? It's a very important verse. Now, verse 33, if this man were not of God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, you were altogether born in sins, and you teach us? They cast him out. He was thrown out of the synagogue. Now his friends couldn't talk to him. He was disfellowshipped. He was excommunicated. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, if you've ever been cast out of a church, disfellowshipped, excommunicated, Jesus may be looking for you to find you. Because he said, he that comes to me, I will in no wise cast out, but men may cast you out. When he had found him, he said, do you believe on the Son of God? I've actually heard it taught that Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God. He asked this man, now do you believe on the Son of God? The man said, well, who is he, Lord, that I might believe? And Jesus said, you have both seen him, and it is he that talks, present tense, talks with you. I'm talking with you. So he's telling this man, I am the Son of God. Jesus did not deny he was the Son of God, even though you've heard preachers maybe say that. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I am come into this world, that they who see not might see, and that they who see might be made blind. That's interesting, isn't it? Now the Pharisees heard him say this. And some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said, are we blind also? Wanting to get Jesus' opinion. Verse 41 is very instructive. Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you should have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sins remains. Now, what is encouraging about that verse? Maybe you've studied doctrine and you're not sure about this, you're not sure about that, you're still unsure, you're kind of in ignorance about certain things. If you are truly, truly in ignorance and you really just don't know, God knows you don't know. And therefore, he says you have no sin. You're not accountable. Oh, you may still break the speed limit, but you're not accountable in God's sight. Now, the policeman may not feel that way. But you see, the point I'm making is, for example, back years and years ago, I studied this sacred name doctrine. Should we say God's name only in Hebrew? Well, I studied it thoroughly, and I came to realize how stupid, ridiculous, nonsensical, and utterly crazy that is, that God can only hear you when you speak Hebrew. Well, look, you Southerners don't have a chance then, because you can't pronounce Hebrew. You know, now, in fact, even speaking in English, there are different ways of saying the name Jesus. Up in New York, they say Jesus. I never could stand that. But it's okay, God hears them. Down in Louisiana, they say Jesus. They pronounce it different. Now, if you go south of the border, they say Jesus. Spelled the same name, but the pronunciation differs. Now, we say it correctly here, don't we?
Good Southern English.
Good old Southern English. I bet you when you stand before the pearly gates one day, the Lord will say, howdy, y'all. You know, that's what we're hoping for anyway. That's what we're hoping for. So, I might be exaggerating a little bit. But, you know, what if it really is true that you're supposed to say God's name only in Hebrew? So you go up to one of these people and you say, how do you say it? Oh, you have to say Jehovah. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses say. Go up to somebody else. No, you got to say Yahweh. Well, which is it? Somebody else says, oh, it's neither one of those. People have actually said this. You got to say Yahuwah. Oh. Then you go to another person. No, it's Yahweh. I used to be on the mailing list of somebody. I forget where they were out in the Midwest. They sent me a little magazine published by the Assemblies of Yahweh. Who's right? Even if I believed I had to say God's name in Hebrew, I am ignorant of what the true pronunciation is, and obviously so are they. So God winks at ignorance. So even if I'm supposed to say God's name in Hebrew, God knows Keith Slough doesn't know how to say it. So therefore, I have no sin.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So in the original Greek, how did you see how the spelling of Jesus was?
Well,
How do you pronounce it?
The name Jesus starts with the letter iota, which is like an I. And the letter I can be pronounced like an E or like a Y sound. So technically there is no J in the Greek, but that's no big deal. Because if you look at the old 1611 King James Version, even when you see the name Jesus is spelled with an I, not a J. The letter J came from originally the letter I. If you go back and study the English. And so it might have been pronounced Jesus, or Jesus, might have been pronounced Jesus. I think it's a short E. I believe it's an epsilon in Greek, which would be Jesus. But on the other hand, we're not exactly sure. I've got several Greek textbooks at home, and one of my Greek textbooks written by a fellow named Bauer, right on the front page, it gives you the alphabet, and then there's a footnote at the bottom of the page, and it says, the way we pronounce these, even the letters, is only guesswork. We really don't know how to pronounce those letters.
So in the Greek, it began with an I?
It began with an I, and the way we say it in English is Jesus. But remember this, God made all the different languages, and there's pronunciations in every language. So, and no matter how you pronounce it, if you pronounce God's name respectfully, and you hallow his name, God honors that. There was a lady up in Ohio, I went up there to have communion with them at Passover, and this lady told me that her friend had told her, you should never say the name Jesus, because there's no J in the Greek. I said, well, go back and tell her to pronounce it Jesus then. That makes her happy, which is silly. You know, I've had untold numbers of miracles I've seen. Praying for people, laying hands on people in the name of Jesus. And you know what? God heard me, because those people were healed. I've seen people healed instantly. I've seen people get up out of their beds in the hospital and run up down the hall. I saw one guy do that. Another fellow had 90 days to live, and he was totally and completely healed of leukemia. And I did it in the name Jesus, which is Greek, but that's the way we pronounce it here in North Carolina. Good question. Any other questions?
Didn't we, one of the times that we went to the Greek festival with Dr. Roller, we spoke to one of the church members of the Greek Orthodox Church, and you were asking her about the pronunciations, and she said that even now nobody really knows how to speak ancient Greek.
Ancient Greek, yeah.
So even now nobody really knows how to speak ancient Greek. It's the modern Greek that they speak.
Yeah, nowadays Greek people speak what we would call modern Greek. In fact, when John Roller and I went down to a Greek restaurant down here in Albemarle, he took the Greek New Testament with him. He walked up to the girl and he said, could you read this for me in Greek? She said, I can't read that. It was Greek to her. And yet she spoke fluent Greek. She spoke fluent Greek, but she could not read 2,000-year-old Greek. That was like us reading Chaucer today. She said, I can make out a word here or there, but I can't read it. So no. So modern day Greek, and just like modern day Hebrew, if somebody said, well, the way you say God's name in Hebrew is such and such, that would be the modern pronunciation. It wouldn't be the way Moses pronounced it. We don't know how Moses pronounced it. Any questions on that? Dear me, we won't have time to get into chapter 10. Some of these are long chapters.
There's a question that's kind of off topic that maybe we can pick up at the end.
Okay, well, go ahead and give it to. It's off topic, you say?
A little off topic. It came in earlier,
Well, go ahead and give
and
it
it's
to.
off topic now.
It's off topic now.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, throw it at me.
Okay. Since Christ rose at dusk at the end of the Sabbath, doesn't that mean that Christ was crucified on Wednesday?
Absolutely. Yeah, because he was 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb. He couldn't have been in there after Saturday night was over. That'd be 4 nights. So he had to be risen no later than about dusk Saturday evening. 3 days and 3 nights. Tell you what, we're going to start chapter 10, but we're not going to go any further down than verse 6. Verily always means truly. Truly, truly, I say to you, he that enters not by the door into the sheepfold, if he climbs up some other way, he's a thief and a robber. Now, all of you came in here today. You were invited to come in. You came in through the door. But a thief might come through the window, except we've got bars on the windows. We didn't put them on there. Somebody else did. So a thief can't get in here. But if they were going to come in, they wouldn't come in through the door. They'd sneak in by the window. And Jesus said that people who, if you go home today after church and you see somebody trying to slip through your window, that automatically tells you he's probably a thief. The same as a thief and a robber, but he that enters in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. The shepherd would come through the door, of course. To him, the porter, the guy who's standing at the port or the door, opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Now, well, let me finish reading this, then I'm going to explain something to you. And when he puts forth his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, and they know his voice. And a stranger they won't follow, but they will flee from him, for they don't know the voice of strangers. Now, I want you to look at verse 6. This parable spoke Jesus to them, but they understood not what things they were which he spoke to them. Now, I want to point something out to you. A parable Everybody understood the typical meaning of the parable. They didn't understand the spiritual meaning behind it. For example, remember he said, he gave 7 parables in Matthew 13. A farmer goes out to sow, and he sows a seed, and he's spreading seed out here, and some of it comes up and some of it doesn't. He turns around and walks off. They think, what was that about? They know what it means to sow a seed. They know what it is to get a harvest. They didn't understand the spiritual meaning behind it. Same thing is true here. Everybody knew what he said. Everybody knows what a shepherd is. Everybody knows what sheep are. They all knew this. But it says it was a parable, so it had a deeper hidden meaning, and that is not what they got. That's what, see, parables, everybody understood the parables because he would use physical things. It's kind of like if I said to you, if I gave you a parable, a man may drive by your street and he may turn into your driveway and he may not, and I turn around and walk off and you think, huh, what? That's a dumb thing to say, but it might have a deeper meaning to it. That'd be a parable. You know, and Jesus would say things like that, and they'd scratch their head and say, why is he telling us that? What's that got to do with anything? What's he talking about sheep and shepherds? What's that got to do with it? Well, you and I who have studied the New Testament, we know that Jesus is the shepherd, and we are likened unto sheep, and we hear his voice. Verse 7, I am going to go ahead and read this, got a little bit more time here. Verily, verily, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. You can't get into God's kingdom except through the door. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers. Buddha came before Jesus. Krishna apparently did, I'm not sure, but I know Buddha did like 500 years before. But they can't get you into God's kingdom. But the sheep did not hear them, the real people of God. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved and shall go in and find pasture. Again, he's speaking metaphorically. The thief comes not except for one thing. They come to rob you. They come to steal, and if necessary, to kill you to get your money and to destroy. You've seen on TV shows where thieves will break in and they'll just start pulling drawers out, throwing stuff everywhere, looking for a paper or something, throwing things everywhere, and they don't bother to clean up when they leave. They just leave the place in a mess, and the people come home and they see their house has been gone through. I guess that's how thieves do it. They don't bother to be neat. So they destroy. They'll destroy your house looking for something. I am come that they might have life. They might have it more abundantly. Well, I have life now. But he said, no, I've come here to give you life. He's talking about everlasting life. But he that is a hireling, the employee who works for a paycheck, and not the shepherd whose own the sheep are not, he sees the wolf coming. The wolf comes and he leaves the sheep. He takes off and flees, and the wolf catches them and scatters the sheep. The wolf will catch a sheep here or there. The rest of the sheep are scared and they take off and run. David stood by the sheep, didn't he? He fought a wolf, he fought a lion, he fought a bear, whatever it took. He loved those sheep. But a hireling is just the guy that got paid. He's just getting paid by the hour. And when he sees the wolf coming, I'm not going to stay here and take care of those sheep. I'm not risking my life for those sheep, and I don't even own them. Jesus said, basically, he owns the sheep, and he was willing to give his life for them. The hireling flees because he's a hireling and cares not for the sheep. He says, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep and am known of mine. I'll conclude with that. Let me say this. Jesus knows his sheep by name. How could he not when your name is written in heaven? Remember the book of Luke? He said, your names are written in heaven. Who wrote them down? Well, somebody up there who knows your name. You ever thought about the fact that Jesus knows your name? Think about that. It's easy for us to know him, but he knows us. He knows us. He knows our names because he cares that much about us. He said even the hairs of your head are numbered. He cares about you enough to know your name. You ever met somebody and you didn't really care to know them, so you didn't bother? 5 minutes later, you couldn't remember their name. But if you met somebody you really cared to get to know, you'd remember their name all week long. Jesus cares about us and he knows our name. Any questions? Y'all are a quiet bunch today.
I was just thinking, it's amazing how God works stuff out. A lot of the lesson that I had with Paxton today was talking about the Pharisees and how self-righteous they were and how they didn't have faith in Christ.
Yeah.
It all just worked out today.
The Pharisees were separatists, and they were very, very righteous in their own eyes. Any other questions? Good to see everybody here. Good to see y'all again. Glad you're doing well. And we're missing a few people today. Some are out for various reasons, but they'll be back with us next week. So be blessed. We're dismissed. See y'all next week.